Hi there. My name is Ian Rocksborough-Smith, and welcome to this interview session that's being produced for the Labor and Working Class History Association's blog, Labor Online. And I'm really thrilled to have with us here today the author of On the Waves of Empire, U.S. Imperialism and Merchant Sailors, 1872 to 1924, Dr. William Riddell, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And really just super excited to have you, Will, on this podcast interview and to be able to kind of talk to you about this fascinating book that I know has been with you for many years. We both went to grad school together in Toronto many years
Yes.
ago, and I've been fortunate to stay in touch with you and to call you a friend as well. So I'm very thankful to be able to talk to you today about this wonderful book, which is now got pages and a wonderful cover. I'd like to just sort of try and get the conversation going here by
Sure.
asking you, I guess, first of all, if you could tell the viewers and the listeners of this Labor Online podcast, what first drew you to this project? What first drew you to this topic for research?
It's a great question. Thanks, Ian. So I think what drew me to it initially was, I mean, as you said, it's been with me a while because it was my PhD dissertation, and it's I guess the first book, as I'm learning, is a really long process of grad school, not really knowing what you're doing, figuring it out, and then eventually adapting it to a book. But I think what drew me to this particular to sailors, to looking at the merchant marine industry, particularly on the Pacific, was the sort of broad questions I had when I came into grad school. I mean, we all kind of have a sort of broad notion of what we want to do, but don't really know how to do it. And there were sort of basically two books and an obscure Supreme Court case that led me to specifically this topic. And so I first started thinking about sort of these broad questions of the line between subjecthood and citizenry, or metropole and periphery, nation and empire, and thinking about sort of the in-betweenness of that. And I think, labor history's done a really good job at this kind of thing, right? When we sort of think about the sort of, critique the binary of free and unfree labor. And of course, we know it's a broad spectrum. So I was thinking about those questions, but with regard to citizenship and subjecthood, or metropole and periphery. I mean, we tend to think of it, although we know, I think, that it's not just a clear break from this is the nation and this is the empire, or this is a citizen and this is a subject. So these were kind of the broader questions I had, but I didn't really know where to look to answer these questions or who to find these overlaps in. So the first sort of thing that got me thinking about this was the work of Julie Green, obviously a great labor historian, and particularly her book, Canal Builders, about the Panama Canal. And I remember reading through it, getting to this really interesting part of the book where she talks about how there was this kind of hierarchy of skill and unskill. And as you can imagine, in an American imperial context, the skilled workers, the engineers, the administrators were sort of, white Americans, quote unquote, from the United States. And the workers actually physically building the canal were either some Panamanian workers and say Afro-Caribbean migrant workers that were brought in mostly from Trinidad, some from Jamaica, into the Panama Canal Zone to actually build it. And so she has this really interesting episode where all the people that go down to work on the canal from the United States, as I said, are usually administrators, engineers, these kinds of things. But there's one incident of a man who goes down, he's just a general laborer. And he gets down there and he realizes very quickly that the jobs that he wants to do are not really meant for him. And sort of he's uncomfortable with it. The canal authorities are uncomfortable with this subversion of kind of race and hierarchy. But it eventually sorts itself out. And she has this great line where she said, it eventually sorted itself out when he realized that these jobs were not meant for people like him. And that got me thinking of, well, who is empire meant for specifically? I mean, we kind of know this in a broad sense. Well, of course, it's meant for the colonizers or the imperialists. But then, of course, that raises the question, well, who are the colonizers? Who are the imperialists? And again, from sort of 50,000 feet or 100,000 feet, it's somewhat obvious, right? Who are the colonizers and who are the colonizers? And that sort of got me thinking about David Montgomery's famous formulation that workers cease to be democratic citizens while on the job. So I started thinking, well, maybe looking at the experience of working class whites in empire might be a way into this, because after all, they are citizens, they have access to the machinery of American democracy, so to speak. But at the same time, as Montgomery said, at work, they sort of cease to be citizens, at least in that particular context. So I started thinking, well, what did they think of empire? What did it mean to them? Did they benefit from it? Did they think they benefited from it? Were they for imperialism, against American imperial expansion? And that was sort of what I started to think about. And then the other thing that got me thinking was this idea of how, and again, this was all from Julie Green, about this idea of how imperialism affects not just class conflict, but class formation. So I started thinking about the opposite, which was, well, how does class conflict and class formation affect imperial expansion? So at this point, I had sort of figured out, okay, I want to look at sort of how not just working class whites, but through their labor organizations, what they thought of empire and sort of how they engaged in it. What role did they play? Were they complicit? But I still didn't know where to look. And so the other book that led me to this was a really great book by a British imperial historian named Tony Ballantyne. I think he's still based in New Zealand. He wrote this great book called Orientalism and Race. And what was interesting about it was the way he conceived of empire, that it wasn't this kind of, traditional metropole and periphery, right? It's there, that we tended to think of empire in a kind of center and spoke kind of thing, right? There's London, and then everything else emanates from London. But what he showed was that empire is actually a series of interconnected webs of authority. Yes, London might be the biggest authority in the British Empire, but there's imperial subcenters. Places like Calcutta was sort of the bastion of British power, not just in India, but the Indian Ocean world. And that kind of projected power onto, say, Oceania. And then Oceania projected power onto British colonial spaces in Polynesia. What was also interesting about this was that it wasn't just these imperial subcenters. They often sat at key imperial junctures. So obviously, India being a sort of more colonial imperial colony, the traditional colony when we think of the British Empire, Australia being a white settler colonial space. So you have a kind of British imperial subcenter in Calcutta projecting power onto a settler space in Australia, which is then projecting power onto a kind of non-settler space in Polynesia, so to speak. So I started thinking, well, where are those junctures in the American empire? Where do you actually look for it? And that led me to San Francisco, which in some ways fits all these categories that Ballantyne was talking about. It's kind of an imperial subcenter, right? Projecting power out onto the Pacific. And you can see that when you actually go to, San Francisco and you stand in Union Square, there's a monument to Admiral Dewey and his defeat of the Spanish fleet of Manila in 1898. But the other key thing is that it sits at an imperial juncture, right? On the one side of it is a settler space, a white settler territory that, of course, had been expanding, especially at a rapid pace after the American Civil War, onto the Pacific, which is more of a colonial imperial space. And that's sort of how I started thinking about why to look there. Now, I didn't know I was going to look at sailors yet. What led me to sailors was when I went to the archives in San Francisco. I went to, I think, Bancroft Library, the California State Library. And I came across this really interesting Supreme Court case called the Arago case, which for those that study, maritime history in the United States will know about it. But outside of that, I had never heard of it. And it was this really fascinating case. It takes place between, the incident happens in 1895, and the case actually is decided in 1897. And what's really interesting about it is it gets at all these questions of not just citizen and subjecthood, but where that line between metropole and periphery is, and also why that matters. And the key thing was, basically, these 4 sailors desert their ship in Astoria, Oregon. Now, at the time, you still had the penal enforcement of labor contracts, right? Which has, of course, existed for a long time in, say, indentured labor relationships. And basically, these sailors desert their ship and then, of course, are hauled back onto the ship and then put in chains, because you could actually be thrown in jail for desertion, or you could be brought back to your ship. There was these sort of asymmetrical maritime contracts that go all the way back to 1790, sort of affirmed again in 1872. And for 9 months, they sit in jail. And the Sailors Union of the Pacific, which is recently formed, challenges this case all the way to the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court comes back in 1897, they make a really interesting ruling in sort of 2 ways. The first thing is that they argue that the 13th Amendment, of course, the amendment that abandons slavery and forced servitude, does not apply to sailors. And more specifically, it doesn't apply to sailors in the foreign trade. Now, what was interesting about this case was you have 4 sailors deserting a ship, an American flag ship in an American port. But because the ultimate destination of that ship was in South America, Supreme Court ruled that it was outside the domestic trade. So outside the domestic labor market, basically in the foreign, or you could argue imperial trade. And so that's why this matters. Operating outside of it meant that you didn't actually have the protection of the Constitution. So a couple of years before the famous debate of whether the Constitution follows the flag in 1898, Supreme Court had already said, well, it doesn't in 1897, a year before, and with regard to sailors. The other key thing that's interesting about this case is that the Supreme Court further affirms the kind of peculiar nature of maritime labor. And it basically says that even if you didn't have this issue of domestic and foreign, it argues that the 13th Amendment doesn't apply to it because maritime labor is an exceptional class of labor. And this is sort of key, that it's an exceptional class of labor and therefore doesn't necessarily fall under the protection of the Constitution and laws of the United States. Now you can imagine the implications for this. And in 1898, when the United States acquires quote unquote formal colonies, this question comes up again. So part of my argument is that these questions already existed in the shipping industry, which is why it's such an important industry to look at how, say, working class Americans, in this case, working class whites, how they think of and how they experience empire. And in this way, sailors are sort of key voices in figuring out what imperialism meant to working class whites and the labor organizations that claim to speak on their behalf. And that's kind of what led me to it.
Yeah, no, it's totally fascinating, both the sort of journey into the subject and into the research that you described, but also just the dynamics of thinking about kind of labor and empire formation in American history. And like it really struck me that these sailors, and particularly the leaders of these sailors unions, were real agents of empire in their own way, and were kind of key in helping to shape arguably what America's empire making looked like through that turn of the 20th century period. So I was really struck as well, like you kind of touched on it a moment ago, but so much of the book focuses on these sort of fascinating dynamics about the territoriality and manifestation of empire making, and how it was born in part from domestic class conflict. And I wondered if you could maybe expand on that a bit, because it seems like class conflict, and it's something that would definitely interest readers of Labor Online and on Labor and Working Class History Association. Why was domestic class conflict so central to this kind of story that you're telling in this book?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question, because part of the reason why it's central, and part of the larger argument that I'm making, is the question of what is the empire and what is the nation, or even more specifically, the relationship between the nation and empire. Now, obviously, the insular cases are often what historians look to, and they're a tremendous resource in trying to figure that out. In a lot of ways, it is how the United States works out its relationship with its colonies or other forms of imperial space. But what I'm looking at as well is that these questions ultimately are labor questions. What is the empire and what is the colony? What is the domestic? What is the foreign? Are really questions of labor, particularly when you look at the empire, for lack of a better word, sort of from the bottom up. Right, a lot of work on the history of empire looks at sort of the key, kind of statesmen of empire, your Theodore Roosevelts, your Alfred Beveridges, your Admiral Dewey's, that kind of thing. And part of what I'm trying to do is look at it from the bottom up. And when you look at it from the bottom up, the way that, say, sailors, more broadly, the American Federation of Labor, the Sailors Union of the Pacific, actually see empire is about the integration of different labor markets and labor systems. Now, some of this debate happens in 1898. And that's partly why it matters. It's why, to get to your question, there's a sort of territoriality of it, but then also empire as an analytic concept, which I think is one of the things you were getting at. And that's partly why we have to see empire specifically as both an analytic concept or a relational process, as well as a thing to identify, right? It's this idea of, do we make empire a verb or do we make it a noun? And Moonho Jung talks about this in his recent book, Menace to Empire, and has an important reminder that on the one hand, we do need to see it as a process, right? William Appleman Williams talked about this 50, 60 years ago, to understand the more informal ways that states, and in particular the United States, exercises imperial power. But it's also important to remember that it is a thing. And the reason it's important to remember that it is a thing is if we make everything sort of an imperial process, then, well, nothing is. And also it could potentially obscure those who actually struggle against the American empire, which I think the argument that Moon Ho Jung makes. Now, why I see it as both is because when I dug into the research, you really had to see it as both. On the one hand, part of what I'm arguing is that the ship itself is an American imperial formation, and this is partly what the struggle is about. Sailors within the United States, white sailors, would very much like the merchant ship to be considered part of the domestic US labor market. Shipping company executives, shipping capital would very much like to see it as an imperial formation for obvious reasons, particularly when the Supreme Court rules in 1897 that, in the foreign trade, it's actually not falling under the protection of the US Constitution. In a lot of ways. And this actually makes us rethink 1898 and the debate over it a little bit, largely because when we're talking about the Constitution following the flag, if you look at the Argo decision, and this is certainly something that the sailors and as well as the American Federation of Labor realized themselves, was that if the Supreme Court can declare a particular type of labor, an exceptional class of labor that falls outside of the Constitution, well, could it do it with contract workers in Hawaii? Could it do it with the labor systems in Cuba or the Philippines? So in a way, the sailors are arguing that it doesn't really matter whether the Constitution follows the flag. It can, and if the Supreme Court declares a labor system exceptional, then it falls outside of that. So in a way, they see the Argo decision as the means to bring the labor systems of Hawaii and the Philippines into the nation. Which is partly why, say, the sailors' unions and the American Federation of Labor are so against the annexation of Hawaii and the Philippines. It's not specifically because they are anti-imperialist, although they certainly would identify that way. Part of what I argue is it's not so much that they're anti-imperialists, it's just that they're pro one form of imperialism and not another. They're pro-white settler colonialism, but they're against colonial imperialism because they see colonial imperialism as the integration of uneven labor markets and labor systems, which they see as a threat to the sort of emerging predominance, at least in the West Coast and amongst white Americans, of free labor within the nation.
Right. And I feel like part of your argument too extends to this notion that they were also extending an idea of like white settler colonialism, right, into their their complicity with empire making. I wonder if you could maybe expand on that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's essentially the argument I make, is that the way that the sailors' unions are thinking about the merchant ship is, on the one hand, merchant ship is not territory. You can't occupy the ocean in the same way that you can occupy land, even if you have a really big navy. But you can occupy the jobs on the ocean, right? And I think, when you get to the First World War, I think it's something like, at any given time, there's thousands of sailors laboring afloat the world's oceans, 2 million sailors all over the world. And so who occupies those jobs? And this was something that was key to the sailors' union. And part of what they see as a key marker, and this is one of the key things I argue in the book, of what makes the domestic versus the foreign, is protection from racial competition. And the key lever that they use to maintain that protection is the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So one of the things that the sailors are trying to do is apply the Chinese Exclusion Act to American flag vessels. Of course, in 1902, the Chinese Exclusion Act is extended to the Philippines and Hawaii, and essentially says that people from China cannot immigrate to the Philippines or Hawaii, nor can people of Chinese descent in the Philippines and Hawaii migrate to the American mainland. So a key marker of the domestic US labor market, particularly on the West Coast, is protection from racial competition. And of course, this extends well back into the 19th century when the initial panic of Chinese immigration sort of rears itself. And it also, scholars of Chinese immigration have demonstrated this for a long time, but it also reinforces this idea that immigration restriction is not simply immigration, it's actually an act of imperialism. And one of the things I argue is that the Chinese Exclusion Act is wielded by the sailors' unions, and we can talk a little bit later about how they do it, as a kind of repertoire of imperial power to preserve a kind of white settler republic on the West Coast, and from the sailors' perspective, to extend that white settler republic into the merchant marine. It's similar to the argument I think Beth Lou Williams makes in her book, The Chinese Must Go, about contrasting these dreams of kind of these cosmopolitan imperialists with their sights set on China, with the kind of sort of working class whites that had migrated to the West Coast and their dream of a kind of white republic. Well, in a way, it extends into the shipping industry as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating to think about all these sort of intersections too, in terms of contestations between labor and capital, right? And in so many ways, the book helps to kind of recast these often kind of romantic stories about the American labor movement in general. And if you think about like popular histories even from that era, traditional narratives about contestations between capital and labor, and you brought it up a moment ago too, just in terms of the agency that these sailors unions took into kind of putting forward this very exclusionary kind of politics, this this politics of whiteness, really, that they seem to be beholden to. I'm wondering why they didn't make more common cause with sailors and workers from other nationalities and backgrounds through this period. I mean, were there opportunities for these kinds of things, or what happened to lead them away from any potential solidarities in an international sense?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, it is one of the most frustrating aspects of, I think, turn of the 20th century labor history, is why don't they do that? And of course, Du Bois is, the first one to talk about this. And I mean, in many ways, as you know, every time we think we have a good idea, Du Bois probably thought of it first. And we're all very much in his shadow. And I think this is sort of one of the key things, is that, part of the way I kind of articulate it is that they resist empire by aligning with it, right? So they're resisting colonial imperialism by affirming their commitment to white settler colonialism. And the big question is, of course, why do they do this? And I mean, Du Bois partly answered this 120 years ago. They do make some short-term gains by organizing around whiteness. But one of the larger arguments I make is that in the long term, it doesn't serve them. And we can get into that a little bit later, specifically why. But what's interesting, specifically with the sailors, right? And this is why I think when we think about the difference between metropole and periphery, or domestic and foreign, part of what I'm saying is that it's a space of racially inflected class conflict. That's what determines what those lines are, and more specifically in the merchant marine, is where it actually plays itself out on the ground. Although it is part of the larger concern of the AFL and Samuel Gompers. But when it comes to sailors, one of the key things that they actually try to do is they look at their situation. The head of the sailors union on the West Coast, Andrew Faruseth, who is also the president, well, he's actually the secretary on the West Coast, but he runs it essentially. And he's the president of the International Seamen's Union of America, in the national branch. And like everybody at the time, he's reading Alfred Thayer Mahan, right? Everybody's reading Alfred Thayer Mahan. It's what convinces the United States to build a fleet, right? The German, Bismarck is reading it, Kaiser Wilhelm reads it, and this partly leads to the really
influential imperial text, right?
Yeah. Exactly, right? It partly leads to the Anglo-German naval race of the early 20th century. But Faruseth reads it, and he reads it a little bit differently. He agrees with all that. But he specifically, what he pulls out of it is that a well-trained merchant marine is actually a strategic national resource. And it's one of the arguments Mahan makes, is that part of what made the Spanish Navy so powerful back in its day and the British Navy so powerful in the 19th century was they had a sort of reservoir of well-trained merchant sailors who could then join the Navy or be called up to the Navy if they had to expand it in a time of war, like, say, the United States does in 1898. And so Faruseth's argument is that if the American merchant marine uses foreign sailors, and more specifically, when he's talking about foreign sailors, he's talking about sailors from China or Japan, but mostly he's focusing on China. And this is sort of one of the key reasons why whiteness becomes so important. Because when you look at a lot of the leaders of the sailors unions, they're not actually American. Faruseth is from Norway. Paul Scherenberg, who runs the Coast Seamen's Journal for a long time, is from Germany. Walter MacArthur, who is also the editor of the Seamen's Journal, is from Scotland. So none of these guys are actually born in the United States. Now, they're potential Americans, because as we know about the way American citizenship laws worked at the time, and especially by the 1920s, that's how they sort of organize, is around whiteness. And that's part of the argument, is that Faruseth actually says, if we only use Chinese sailors in the American Merchant Marine, then we're effectively training future sailors at the Chinese Navy. And so that's part of the argument of why he makes race. And again, this is another example of them aligning with sort of the imperial state rather than having, say, solidarity with their comrades in China. And this is partly, in a way, what boxes them in to this kind of imperial alignment, which is their whole argument as to why the lives of sailors should improve, why they should be paid more, why they should be respected, why it should be a domestic labor market, why they should be, in his words, emancipated from the sort of unfree practices that the Argo decision kind of sanctifies in 1897, is that they're actually a strategic national resource that any modern imperial state needs to function as a modern imperial state. And this is why he can't make solidarity with them, because he's already aligned himself so deeply with the idea of an American empire.
Right, yeah. And as your book points out, it's kind of like it ends up being a tragic tale for these sailors unions, because essentially it's almost like, I don't know if this is the term you would use at all, but like it's almost like a Faustian bargain that they make. Ultimately, siding with U.S. empire in a way that comes back to bite them, especially after World War One. Maybe you could
a
bit about
absolutely
where things go for these unions.
Oh, definitely. And again, it gets into what Du Bois talks about when he, these sort of short-term psychological wages in a way. And I mean, the book really is framed as a tragedy. So, I mean, as we were speaking earlier, I mean, Andrew Forsyth is a very frustrating figure. It's fascinating. On the one hand,
yeah, he's very frustrating. Want to wring his neck at many points.
Oh yeah, he's so committed to the emancipation of the sailors. To the emancipation of the 4 sailors that deserted in Astoria, Oregon in 1895. But he just cannot get past his own prejudice and his own racism. He doesn't see Chinese sailors as comrades or brothers. He sees them as basically weapons to be wielded or people to be feared. And that's sort of the tragedy of it, that he chooses white supremacy and imperialism over true solidarity. And so, as you pointed out, it kind of works. And really, this alignment with empire for the sailors really only works in the First World War. And it's the very specific circumstances of the First World War, which is, of course, when First World War breaks out, everything he's saying about the merchant marine seems to be vindicated, because all the European fleets withdraw their merchant fleets from normal commerce, right? Because they have to then get turned over to the war effort. Now, by 1914, 90% of all American goods that are imported and exported are on foreign flagged carriers. Now, some of those foreign flagged carriers might be owned by American capital, but they're flagged outside the United States, which means they don't have to conform to laws within the United States. So even if Forsyth did get a Chinese Exclusion Act applied to the American merchant ship, well, you could just switch your merchant ship's registry to British, where it doesn't apply. And this is part of the struggle that he's having. And this is what leads eventually, and we can talk about this a little bit later, the La Follette Act of 1915. But what happens in the First World War is all of a sudden American policymakers realize that they need to build a really big merchant marine because they don't have one. And they can no longer rely on the European merchant marines. So there's this whole effort in 1915, but especially in 1916 and 17, to build this American merchant fleet. And at one point, they actually secure recognition from not only the government, but also the shipping companies of the union. They actually agree to prioritize hiring union members. And then there's all this talk about, the United States needs to have, quote, native born or, potentially, legally naturalized American citizens to become members of the merchant marine. And you see this massive expansion. The sailors unions, I think in 1914 has roughly about 13,000 members, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 on the West Coast. And it balloons to about 120,000 by 1919. So it just gets absolutely massive. And not only are sort of white American union members prioritized in the hiring, they also gain a kind of newfound respect, that the way the government is talking about them, they talk about them as like brave men carrying, the flag of freedom to Europe. They become in some ways the most sought after labor force on the planet, beyond soldiers that are being drafted or volunteered to go fight in World War I. So they temporarily achieve this status as agents of empire. Now, what I mean specifically by agents of empire is that prior to the First World War, you could think of sailors kind of like soldiers. They're more, at the time, objects and instruments of empire. And Forsyth understands this. And so part of how he wants to turn them into agents of empire is emphasizing the important role that they actually play in spreading American empire. Of course, I mean, it's one of the arguments I make. Soldiers may make empire possible. Sailors make it work. I mean, these are maritime empires. Without a merchant marine, without the merchant ship, without sailors, these empires, whether it be the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, British, Japanese, American, doesn't actually function as an empire. So that's how he sees them. But in order to convert them to more agents, they have to have the same rights as workers on land, which is a lot of what he's arguing. And again, that gets into the domestic.
They have to be citizens.
They have to be citizens. Now, of course, shipping capital and shipping companies would very much like to keep their labor force as subjects, which is partly why they start looking to China. I mean, the United States doesn't rule over Chinese territory, but you could make an argument, and I do, that as long as Chinese sailors operate on American ships, they are essentially imperial subjects of the United States empire. It's not to say that they don't resist. It's not to say that they don't have their own agency. Of course they do. But in a way, that relationship becomes imperial. Furseth is trying to change that, but he's trying to do it by extending the domestic labor market into the merchant marine. And this is sort of how they become agents of empire, or at least in his mind, that's his ambition, but it's temporary. Once the emergency of the First World War ends, then everything gets sort of moved back to an emphasis on just cheap labor, right? And of course, the 1920s, like what happens to all sorts of unions in the United States, is it's the open shop era, and the unions get decimated. Now, to your other question of was there an alternative? Of course, there was. Not only does the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, emerge in the 19-teens, at least in the Sailors Union. I think it's founded, was it 1905, 1906? But by the 19-teens, they start to make headway into the sailors' unions. And in a way, you could argue this is a much better form of solidarity, specifically for something like the merchant marine. And it is this alternative. Now, Furseth, on the one hand, despises the IWW. He really believes in a hierarchy of labor, that kind of, the AFL approach, Michael Kazin in a different context called Barons of Labor in San Francisco with, the building trade, was it Hobsbawm? I can't remember who said this idea of a labor aristocracy. Furseth is very much trying to get into that, which is why, in a way, for the AFL's brand of unionism, it's not a big stretch for them to align with empire because they already understand labor as a hierarchy. This is just an imperial hierarchy. And so as the IWW emerge as this sort of alternative, they are challenged to a certain extent. But in many ways, the challenge comes from inside the sailors' union. So what's interesting is the West Coast and the East Coast are a little bit different, as you can probably imagine. And anybody who studies labor on the West Coast and the East Coast, or race on the West Coast and the East Coast, it is a little bit different. The category of whiteness on the West Coast becomes a lot broader earlier, whereas in the East Coast, of course, whiteness in the 1890s, yes, it could mean quote unquote color, but it could also mean ethnicity. Right? When do the Irish, there's lots of literature on the Irish and the Italians becoming white, but in the West Coast, they become white a lot earlier. And I think Linda Gordon talks about this in her book on the Arizona orphanage abduction, which is a really interesting book. But on the East Coast, the sailors look more like the kind of motley crews of Melville, all sorts of different kinds of people. But on the West Coast, most of the sailors' unions are Northern European. So German, Scottish, huge contingent of Scandinavians, which is Andrew Furseth, where he's from. And so there is some tension between these two groups. The sailors on the East Coast are not as committed to exclusion as the West Coast, and for obvious reasons. They are not as close to the labor markets of East Asia. But also what emerges on the East Coast as well is they start to organize Chinese sailors. And they actually try to form an Oriental Seafarers Union in 1919, 1920, 1921. And this is completely rejected by Andrew Furseth, by the larger national organization. And again, it's partly because he's already made that alignment with empire. He spent 20 years talking about how Chinese sailors are not good sailors, these sort of contradictory racialization that's painted of them as either, he sees them as either part of the industrial process, almost machine-like, but then contradictorily, he sees them as kind of overly emotional and panicked-induced children on when something happens on the ship. It's all these stereotypes, and they're completely contradictory, but they believe them.
Yeah.
Right. And so as a result of that, that's basically quashed. But it was this potentially hopeful sign forward. And the two people that actually organized it, Bill Yak, another gentleman named Alina, one of them's from San Francisco, one of them's from Hawaii. And the irony is these guys are actually born in the United States. So they may not be
they're more
white Northern Europe.
True
exactly,
American
right?
than Furseth.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So they may not be born in they may not be white Americans as far as the definition goes at the time, but they are actually born in the United States. Forsyth is not. And so it's this potential pathway forward that they could have taken, and then they don't. And they completely reject this form of solidarity. They double down on exclusion. They reject any IWW challenge on the West Coast. And there's actually a middle way that emerges on the West Coast where certain members of the Sailors Union try to not go in the direction of the IWW. It's a little bit more, not exactly industrial unionism, but not strict craft unionism. They want to amalgamate with the longshoremen. Now, the reason they can't do that,
doesn't it? I remember that section of the book that there's something around the Seattle area that emerges, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it emerges in Seattle, but a couple of things. First, it hates longshoremen. There's a lot of people he doesn't like. He really doesn't like longshoremen. And now part of the argument he gives beyond just he doesn't like them is, I mean, in some ways it kind of makes sense. And part of it is that, well, sailors are always traveling. So if longshoremen and sailors are part of the same union, longshoremen will always outvote sailors because who's to say who's there and who isn't, whereas longshoremen are always in the same place, right? So there's a movement on the West Coast that actually emerges to kind of amalgamate with the longshoremen, not go full into the IWW. Forsyth squashes that as well. So he doubles down not only on racial exclusion, but also very strict sort of hierarchical craft union lines. And then in the early 1920s, he's actually trying to get the 1924 Immigration Act. He fails. He's trying to use it to ban all sailors who would not be eligible for American citizenship on any ship that is bound for the United States, regardless of what country they're flagged in. So he's really trying to push the expansion of that kind of racialized white settler space onto the merchant marine. He fails. And that's kind of the sort of final conclusion of the book is, and it's sort of what you were getting at earlier, which is there are some short-term gains, but it only really happens in a national emergency in World War I. And in a way, by actually pushing for exclusion, they're actually complicit in the segmentation of the global maritime labor market themselves, which actually works against them, right? Now, what's interesting in this case is that the shipping industry from 100 years ago is kind of predictive of where broader industry goes now. And this was sort of the key lesson. The AFL, to a certain extent, succeeds in gaining that protection, right? When they get the Chinese Exclusion Act extended to the Philippines and Hawaii, right? It sort of satisfies their concerns with empire, that, okay, empire is fine as long as the people that we are going to rule over are not allowed to come to the United States. Of course, there's other problems with it as well. But the shipping industry is operationally and transnationally mobile, right? Meaning that they're not bound by territoriality. Now, broader American industry 100 years ago is not transnationally mobile and it's not operationally mobile, with the exception of, say, mining companies, natural resource companies, because minerals are indifferent to imperial boundaries. But as far as the production of goods, most of these companies are not what we would think of as a transnational corporation yet. But of course, now they are. And so it offers these important lessons for today, which is if you actually try to double down on exclusion for labor market protection, there might be some short-term gains, but ultimately you're complicit in the segmentation of the global labor market, which is necessary for the global production process to thrive. As we know, industrial capitalism thrives on the exploitation of difference. So in a way, by doubling down on exclusion, they're actually creating the alternative labor market to replace themselves, which is why it's so tragic that they should have listened to the organizers of the Oriental Seafarers Union to actually follow the movement of capital into those different labor markets.
Yeah, and it speaks so much to the importance of international solidarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between workers' movements and breaking down those barriers between colonial metropole and the racial barriers between workers, which are so obviously propped up by the policies of these sailors unions through this fascinating book. So, Will, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit maybe about where you're planning to go with your future research now that this book is out there for all to read and look at. So just wondering where do you think you're headed now, having completed this great research?
So now I think I'm going to move up in time to the mid 20th century. What I want to do is build a project, a kind of social history built around Lend-Lease. And the reason I'm looking at Lend-Lease is, one, it's a really good way to kind of start in a very contained way. But the big question I want to answer is, when we look at something like Lend-Lease, there's a ton of literature on how Roosevelt gets it passed, how he justifies it. What I want to look at is, okay, yes, he's got it passed. How do these goods actually move? And more broadly, the shift, and you can start with Lend-Lease from a British-led world order to an American-led world order. And again, what I want to do is look at it sort of from the bottom up. Instead of looking at sort of the commanding heights of imperialism, I want to look at how it plays out on the ground. Now, right now, it's very sort of broad, as you know, I'm thinking about these things. But look at specifically when the United States takes over colonies that were formerly run by the British. Does that affect labor hierarchies? Does it affect social hierarchies, class structure? What do the people that live there actually think of this shift? Do they notice it? Who do they ally with? How does this affect the sort of larger imperial geography of the post-war period in the United States? What I'd like to be able to do is kind of show a map of trade flows, 1938, 1939, and then show another one in like 45, 50, 65, and sort of tell this sort of social and labor history of what that shift actually looks like on the ground, as part of a way to do empire in a way, from the bottom up, so to speak.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, and also a way to sort of further complicate the picture of the United States being sort of the beacon of so-called freedom in the world, after World War through and after World War II, right? So,
well, exactly, and I guess the advantage is, I mean, this project, like anybody who studies the Gilded Age and Progressive era, but particularly with sailors, you're struggling to find sources. I think with the next project, it'll be the opposite. There's just going to be so much material that it'll be difficult to actually separate what I actually want to do with it.
Might be an opportunity as well that you could look again at some of the sailors who were in the Merchant Marine during and after World War II, kind of connected to some of those, how they were responding to some of those economic policies.
Well, exactly. Exactly. And part of what happens with the Sailors Union ultimately is that unions are destroyed in the 1920s. There's a resurgence in the 1930s, like there is in a lot of places. Obviously, they do very well during the Second World War, particularly in the West Coast, given the fact that it's a two-front war. Mm-hmm. But the 1950s is the emergence of containerization and the flag of convenience system. You could trace it to the 20s, but it really takes off in the 1950s. And again, it gets back to this, short-sighted policy of alignment with empire. If you look at the modern sort of merchant marine industry, it hasn't really changed in 100 years. What has changed is which countries have the largest merchant fleet, but they decidedly lost. I mean, it exists outside of a domestic US labor market. I think up until the early 21st century, the world's largest merchant marines were flagged in Liberia and Panama for reasons that would be obvious to any labor historian. And now my guess would be, but I don't have the data with me, is probably China has one of the largest merchant fleets in the world. So the consequences of what happened 100 years ago are still very much with us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Will, I'm really thankful you took the time to talk with us today, and really thankful to be able to chat with you about your great book. And I just encourage all listeners and or readers of Labor Online, the Labor and Working Class History Association, to check out a copy of the book here. Sorry, I had it upside down there.
Oh, worries.
Waves of Empire, U.S. Imperialism and Merchant Sailors, 1872 to 1924, University of Illinois Press, 2023. Will, thanks a lot. And
hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great chatting.
Sounds good. Take care.